Molly, to switch topics, I understand that there's a negative relationship between money and the pharmaceutical industry. It causes a negative impact on society. Tell us about that, please.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And there's all the ways that we hear about in the news and that some politicians talk about on the supply side, on the medical side of when you get drugs. Things like not negotiating drug prices, things like not being able to import drugs from Canada, and pharmaceutical puts immense amount of money into lobbying and campaign contributions in order to get favorable legislation for themselves.
It permits this to continue, of course.
Yeah, exactly. And to even, there's even been some things that have increased their profits and increased this problem. But there's actually a lot of other problems that are on the research side, and especially the patent side of medicine, that also have this problem, and that a lot of people are maybe ignore because it's not on the news. People don't like talking about patent reform as much.
Molly, that's your industry, correct?
So I do research, and we also file patent applications. I have a few patent applications, and there's definitely issues with the way they're filed, and there's issues with the way they're renewed within the industry. So I work in the academic side, where we don't we don't really have lobbyists. We're not in there for making money, but we're in the same system. And one of the problems the pharmaceutical industry is that they keep getting their patents renewed. That it'll be about to expire to a generic, and then they'll make a small change to it and be able to renew their patent. And there isn't enough rigor on saying whether or not that really should count as a new drug.
Molly, be specific. Explain for our viewers exactly what you're talking about with this whole patent process, why they're renewing it, and why that costs more to consumers.
Right.
For people who aren't on medication.
Yeah, absolutely. So you'll have a company that has a drug that they develop through R&D. And so
R&D.
So for research and development.
Thank you.
So maybe it started in academia and someone invented a drug, but then they figured out the dosage and how your body breaks it down and how long it lasts and the formulation that you would be given, and that does cost money. And in order to incentivize the drug companies to do that work, which does cost money, they get what's called exclusive rights, which means that they file a patent. This is ours, this is our formulation, and they are the only person that can use that information and that drug to sell it to the public. And so that's what we call a brand name drug. And it costs more. So they get control of the pricing. But there's a time limit put on it. You can't keep your patent forever. At some point, depending on the type of drug it is and what it's for, the patent runs out, and then other companies, what we call generics, can manufacture the same thing and sell it for a lot less. And part of the reason they can sell it for less is they're not the ones that invested in the research, and theoretically that patent time is supposed to be long enough that the drug industry can recoup their costs and still make a profit off of doing all this research and clinical trials.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the problem isn't that they get patents. That does incentivize research and innovation. The problem is that they abuse the system. They'll tweak it. Maybe it's the same drug and it goes from liquid to pill or vice versa, and then they claim that it works better, or they run an advertising campaign and they get all the doctors to switch to this new one, and now everyone wants a liquid or everyone wants a pill, and then the generic can't use that new formulation because there's a new patent on that. They have to wait till that patent runs out.
I imagine this is where all their lobbying money comes in, and all their representatives in Congress comes in to help them get away with this.
Yes, and there's actually this whole other industry behind it that has to do with orphan diseases, which are just starting to be in the news a little bit, but it's been a problem for a while, and this is a well-meaning law that the pharmaceutical industry is abused to make their patents last longer.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, so an orphan disease is a disease that doesn't affect very many people. And typically, there isn't a large incentive for the pharmaceutical industry to develop drugs for people, even if it's a horrible disease that don't affect very many people, because you don't get to sell very many drugs. And so the government put in place all of these incentives to lower the financial barrier for them creating drugs for these diseases. And in some ways that was a really good idea. I mean, you want people, maybe there's only 1,000 people, but it's a horrible disease. I mean, we want drugs for those people.
Sure.
The problem is it gets abused by drugs that maybe have been on the market for a really long time, but someone gets a patent for this specific use in this specific formulation, and they have an advertising campaign, and so then they actually get a new patent on something that might have been a vitamin or something like that before. But now if you want to prescribe it, you have to go through this patent and use it. And so there's actually this whole consulting industry also around some company has a drug and they want to use it for something that maybe already has a treatment, or so it'd be really hard to do the clinical trials, or they want to they just don't want to pay as much to do their trials, or they want their patent to last longer on something's running out and they want to renew their patent. And there's all sorts of loopholes for orphan drugs to extend all these things and save them money if they can prove it works for an orphan disease. And there's a whole consulting industry around finding orphan diseases for these drugs. And this is actually something I did. I worked on a consulting project during my graduate work doing this, where they give you, this is the drug, this is what we want to target, and you need to find us an orphan disease so that we can actually use all these loopholes. And I mean, it's completely legal. There's nothing nefarious about it, but it was basically written in. And so they're trying to use loopholes to essentially market a drug for something that is not an orphan disease by finding an orphan disease that it may or may not actually work that well for. It's just that there's no treatment for that disease.
Sure.
And it makes it so our patents last a long time. And so you end up not having the generic alternative when you really should, because they're gaming the system and they lobby Congress and they lobby the representatives in order to keep these loopholes in place for themselves.
How much is this costing the country? An estimate? Is there any data on this?
A lot. I mean, drugs are one of the major, drug costs are one of the major problems with our medical costs. And I don't know if you could put an exact price tag on it, because it depends also. All these things add up, right? Like if we imported drugs from Canada, this would have less of an effect, because now we could import generics from Canada also, or things that cost less. But I mean, it's billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. It's a lot. And the other side of this is also back in before 1980, when a patent was developed, it was owned by the government agency. So your tax dollars pay for NIH research that develop a drug, and then there's a patent filed for it.
By the government agency?
Before 1980.
Right, I understand.
Yeah,
sure.
The government agency.
Right.
So the NIH with the researcher would own the patent. And
NIH, National Institute of Health.
Well,
okay.
They're the ones that paid for it.
Gotcha.
If the National Science Foundation or the Department of Energy, whoever funded it. And they would be what's called non-exclusive licenses, and which means that anyone could use this information. It was sort of in the public domain for the public good. And that sounds really good, but there are problems with non-exclusivity, where there's no incentive for these drug companies to do the clinical trials, because they don't get the patent at the end to be the only one that sells it. They could do all this research and a whole bunch of people could use it and sell, they'd have all this competition even though they invested. And so it did stifle innovation in a lot of ways to not have exclusive licenses. And in 1980, there was the Bayh-Dole Act, which reformed this. And it did solve the exclusivity problem. It allowed for government-funded research to create exclusive licenses that the pharmaceutical industry could buy, or they could buy the patent to, have a brand name drug, not have generic competitors. And that was good in that it created a financial incentive for them to actually do the research and get drugs to market. The problem was, at the same time, they removed the public benefit from the patent, that now universities own it instead of the government. And so even though your tax dollars pay for the drug, the government agency never reaps any financial reward from all that investment that they made. And so they always have to be funded anew. There's no money coming back into the agency through the patents that they fund.
So these are the problems. What are the solutions?
Well, we need representatives that are not bought by the pharmaceutical industry to actually push these reforms. And we also need representatives that will understand the role the research process plays in our medical system to have these conversations and bring these issues up at the table in our legislators, as well as the public raising awareness to put pressure. And you can bring it up with your own legislator also and put it in their mind that this is something you care about, this is something you want them to press legislation on.
Let's make an important point here, Molly. There's healthcare acts that were being processed. None of these reforms were included in any of these new healthcare laws. So we can agree here that this is the power of lobbying, the lobbying power of big pharma to make sure that these reforms were not in these healthcare reforms, the new healthcare laws. Can we agree on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, people aren't really having a conversation about how to lower healthcare costs while making it more effective. That it's all about taglines, and it's all on the supply side of how you actually get your provider gives you medicine, and not on how the development side and how it became so expensive to begin with. Although actually in one of the new Republican, I think it was the House tax bill, there actually is a provision to remove one of the tax loopholes for orphan drugs because it's being abused so much, which I was very surprised to see in there. But if you have a Republican representative, this is actually a great opportunity that when you call and say you don't like other things in the tax bill, you can bring up that one piece and say, actually, I really like it if you keep this one thing in. This was something I was happy you put in the bill. It might actually be a good icebreaker with your Republican representative if you disagree with them, to say, actually, do keep this one loophole removal. It's really important for us lowering drug costs.
Molly, you're a fan of the single-payer health system. Just briefly, or in summary fashion, do you want to explain how that would work?
I do believe it's the only financially sound way to provide health care for the entire population. And right now, if you account for all the subsidies that we pay for healthcare through tax deductions and subsidies, as well as the direct payment like Medicare and Medicaid, the government currently pays 64% of all medical costs in the United States. And we just had this conversation about lowering costs. And as we start implementing and making our system more efficient and more effective, we absolutely can lower costs to the point where we can cover everyone better and provide better health care for the same amount we're spending now. But it involves implementing changes to our system to make it more efficient, to take this bloat, to take the profits out of our healthcare system, to make sure that it's really working for the people. And I think the only way to do that is for the government to provide healthcare for everybody so that everyone has access, and that if we implement changes like this along the way of that, it won't actually cost us that much, and that the actual medicines people were paying for with the single payer system will be working for us.
Molly, I had a guest on the show, Simon Campbell from England, who came in and said that we do have a good system where people can get health care and not have to wait the length of time to get some treatment, 3 months or so, for some care that some people can just walk into a doctor's office and get. Is there some risk that if we go to single payer that we do get less quality care?
So I absolutely agree that we need to be careful in its implementation, that a haphazard or too rapid implementation of single payer that isn't involving industry experts, people that work in the healthcare industry, providers, could create a system that induces an austerity that reduces our quality of care. And it's something we should be really careful about. And it's one of the reasons I'm running, and one of the reasons I think groups like Physicians for a National Healthcare Program are so important, that we need people on the provider side to be having these conversations and talking about these nuances so that that doesn't happen to our system. And it's why I think in the beginning of healthcare reform, we need to lower costs so that we can expand care without just spending too much money to cover people or having to ration. But I think it's a false perception that we don't ration care now, that maybe someone might have to wait a little while for an appointment that they didn't have to wait for before. That's true, that might happen sometimes but it's because more people are getting care who had no access to health care before. I mean, the reason there's a line is because there's people in that line who weren't able to go to that doctor at all before. And I think also in the beginning, we see this with the exchanges too, and the ACA, that sometimes there's a lot of costs in the beginning because someone has had health care in 30 years. Of course, if you haven't been to the doctor in 30 years, there's a good chance there's something wrong with you when you go to the doctor that they didn't know about. And so you might have high costs and need more treatment in the beginning. But we really should be providing preventative care the whole time to people in a way that we can make sure there's enough providers for everybody. But it absolutely requires careful planning and not a rapid implementation to make sure that there isn't a backlash and to make sure we don't cripple the innovation that happens in our healthcare industry.
So the devil's in the details.
Absolutely, yeah.
Molly, let's leave it there. I want to thank you for being a guest on Delaware County Political.
Thank you for having me.
We have been here with Molly Sheehan, with Dr. Molly Sheehan, and I am your host, Larry DeMarco. If you like this episode, please don't forget to like, follow, share, and subscribe, and forward this link to all your friends on your contact list and Facebook friends. We're signing off. Tune in next time. Bye for now.